Hello friends and students. I am Shrihari Pingle, Assistant Professor in Zoology from Sangamner, Maharashtra, India. Today we will be talking about cardiac cycle. When we focus on these two words, cardiac cycle, we get an idea that we'll be talking about heart and we'll also be talking about a cyclic event. We all know that our heart beats more than 70 times in a minute. But what are all the events which are taking place during that single heartbeat? Those cyclic events are called as cardiac cycle. So if you have to define cardiac cycle, we'll define it as the succession of coordinated activities which takes place during every heartbeat. So each of your heartbeat is having many coordinated events. These coordinated events can broadly be classified into systole and diastole. When I say systole, it simply means contraction of the heart chambers. That means when the heart muscles are contracted. So this systole is further divided into atrial systole and ventricular systole. So far as the structure of heart that we already know that the human heart or the mammalian heart in general has two auricles and two ventricles. So when the auricles contract, it is called as auricular systole or atrial systole. And when the ventricles contract, it is called as ventricular systole. Now, opposite to what systole is, there's something else which is called as diastole. So as I said, that systole is contraction of the heart muscles. That implies that diastole is relaxation of these heart muscles. And result of this relaxation of heart muscles, the blood refills the auricles and ventricle. Now this diastole as compared to systole is a longer phase and it happens rather quickly. Like we have seen in case of systole, the diastole is also classified into two types. One is atrial diastole and another is ventricular diastole. Now let us have a look at what are the various events which are taking place during a cardiac cycle. The first event that takes place during cardiac cycle is called as atrial systole, followed by isovolumetric contraction, then rapid ejection, the fourth event being reduced ejection, fifth isovolumetric relaxation, sixth rapid ventricular filling, seventh reduced ventricular filling. Now the cardiac cycle has been summarized in this picture. Now you can see that this complete cycle takes around 0.8 seconds to complete. As we have discussed in the beginning of this lecture that our heart beats more than 70 times in a minute. That implies that one cardiac cycle would take less than 1 second to complete. So we can see here that the auricular systole, it lasts for around 0.1 second. Ventricular systole starts after 0.1 second and lasts till 0.4 second of the cycle. That means around 0.3 second in all. After that, that means after 0.4 second and ventricular systole has completed, ventricular diastole starts and it is completed in nearly 0.5 second. But you can see here that auricular systole and ventricular diastole at the later stage, they overlap each other. Similarly, here we see that auricular diastole, it takes around 0.7 second to complete. So the time duration of the cardiac cycle can be summarized in this way. We will talk about the auricular systole or atrial systole first. Before we go into details, just have a look at this picture. This picture shows two auricles filled with deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. This place, the small aperture where an auricle opens into ventricle, is called as auriculoventricular valve or AV valve. present on either side. So when the auricle is completely filled with the blood, the valve they open and the blood from the auricle goes into the ventricle. Now this phenomena is simply this, where the sand automatically goes down into the lower chamber, and once small amount of sand remains filled in here, then you have to move it a bit so that it can pass on further into the lower chamber. So prior to systole, remember, systole is contraction of the heart chambers. So when I say atrial systole, I mean contraction of the auricle. So before the actual contraction begins, the blood flows passively, that means without any pressure being applied, from the atrium into the ventricle, just like this. And then the remaining of the blood which is left inside the auricle is pushed into the ventricle as the auricle starts contracting. But this blood which is sent into the ventricles is only a small amount. Now if you look at the pressures and volumes during atrial systole, what you would notice is small rise in pressure depicted by a wave here in the auricles because of that contraction. Now, since the blood arriving at the heart, that means through superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, the blood which has arrived into the heart, it cannot enter the atrium, so it flows back up the jugular vein, causing the first discernible wave in the jugular venous pulse. Now atrial pressure drops when the atria stop contracting. Eventually the contraction in the auricles ceases, and therefore the blood pressure in the auricles drop. This can be depicted here. During the atrial systole, the auricles contract and tops of the volume in the ventricle. So the volume of the blood in the ventricle now increases. Now auricle contraction is completed before the ventricle begins to contract. Now if you have to see atrial systole in ECG, this dark blue shaded region depicts the atrial systole. Now, the impulse which is arising from the SA node is sino-auricular node, results in the depolarization and contraction of the auricle. How do auricles get the impulse that they need to get contracted? This impulse is received from SA node, which is present in the right wall of the auricle. Now, this impulse once received, then the auricles they begin to contract, and this can be seen in the form of a P wave here. And this is because of depolarization. We already know that the muscles they remain in a polarized state because of 3 times more sodium ions on the outer side of the membrane and twice of the potassium ions on the inner side of the membrane. However, this polarization is reversed when impulse arrive, causing the depolarization. And when this depolarization takes place, the auricles they begin to contract. Then another important feature during our functioning of heart is heart sounds. Actually, there are 4 heart sounds classified as S1, S2, S3 and S4. Out of these, S1 and S2 are the normal heartbeats or heart sounds, and S3 and S4 are those heart sounds which occur under abnormal conditions. So there is occurrence of this heart sound which is called as fourth heart sound S4 under abnormal conditions which occur as a result of atrial systole. During congestive heart failure, massive pulmonary embolism, tricuspid incompetence or cor pulmonale, you can observe this abnormal heart sound S4. Now we'll be looking at the second event of the cardiac cycle, which is called as isovolumetric contraction. Now during isovolumetric contraction, the atrioventricular valves close at the beginning. Remember, these are the valves, AV valves. Now these valves close to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricle into the auricle. Now, electrically, ventricular systole is defined as the interval between QRS complex and the end of T wave. You can remember the earlier slide where I have shown the P wave, followed by the P wave is QRS complex. So, the interval from Q to T wave, that means QT interval, represents isovolumetric contraction. However, mechanically, it involves the closure of atrioventricular valve and opening of semilunar valve. So these are the atrioventricular valves over here, and these are the semilunar valves here. So the event taking place from the closure of this valve till the opening of these valves involves isovolumetric contraction. Again, if we look at the pressure and volume dynamics over here, we see that since the AV valves close when the pressure in the ventricles exceed the pressure in the atria. Now, look at these lines, the red ones here and the yellow ones here. Now this is the pressure in the auricle and this is pressure in the ventricle. We are talking about this phase of the cardiac cycle. Now you see here that the pressure in the auricle has gone down because the blood from the auricles has already flown into the ventricles. However, since the ventricle is getting filled up, the pressure in the ventricles is increasing. So this is one important event which is taking place in this phase. As the ventricles contract isovolumetrically, now the ventricles, they will start to begin to contract. Their volume does not change. The volume of the blood, it does not change. So you see here that volume depicted by the white line over here, it remains constant. The pressure, however, will increase because the ventricles have begun to contract isovolumetrically. So volume of the blood depicted by white line here remains constant, but pressure, it will begin to increase depicted by the red line. Now you see that this red line, it starts approaching the green line. This green line is actually the pressure of blood in the aorta and pulmonary arteries. We already know that the blood pressure range in the arteries and pulmonary arteries and aorta is 80 mm of Hg to 120 mm of Hg. So you see this range here, 80 mm of mercury to 120 mm of mercury, and the pressure inside the ventricle goes past 80 mm of Hg, and when it goes past the pressure here, this is the time when semilunar valves will open. Then in terms of the deflections that you get in ECG, this is the phase which is depicted here. The electrical impulse, they propagate from the AV node. Now this is something where you need to concentrate, the AV node. The impulses were actually originated from SA node, that is sinoauricular node, but when the impulses have to travel through the ventricles, the heart needs AV node as well. It is further sent into the lower parts of the ventricle through bundle of Hess and Purkinje fiber system. For this to understand, we'll see this small animation over here. Now here you see that this is the place where AV node is present. This is SA node. So impulse, they start and originate from SA node, then they travel to the AV node, and from the AV node they go into the bundle of Hess and the Purkinje system, so that isovolumetric contraction takes place. This is pretty clear from this animation over here, and these are the deflections that you get in this particular phase. Now, talking about the heart sounds here, there comes the first normal heart sound, which we call as lub. So you can now hear, yeah, these are the heartbeats. So heartbeat is actually comprising of two different sounds, the S1 and the S2. The S1 is called as lub, and this sound that we hear in the heart is because of the closure of auriculoventricular valve or atrioventricular valve. Now we go into the next event, that is a rapid ejection, a very important one, because the body in itself is a big machine that we are having, and heart needs to throw this blood quickly into the complete system. So therefore ejection of the blood has to be a rapid one. So by this time the semilunar valve, as we have discussed already, this we call as semilunar valves, they have already opened, and as a result of this, blood quickly is sent into the aorta and pulmonary arteries. So again, if we look at the pressure and volume changes here, while the ventricles continue contracting, the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery. So this is the time when the pressure has exceeded, the pressure in the ventricle has exceeded the pressure in the pulmonary artery and aorta, and that is why the semilunar valves open and the blood is pushed rapidly into the aorta or the pulmonary arteries. As more blood enters the arteries, pressure there builds until the flow of blood reaches the peak. Now, if you look at the ECG here, you would see that during this phase there is no deflection, as well as there is no heart sound observed during this phase. Then you talk about the next event, which is called as reduced ejection. So the time when the semilunar valves opened for the first time, the blood rapidly had gone into the aorta and pulmonary artery. But slowly you would observe that the volume of blood in the ventricle, it goes on decreasing. And as a result, the flow with which the blood would go into the pulmonary artery and aorta would also reduce, and therefore this phase is called as reduced ejection. Again, we'll have a look at this particular picture and animation over here. I'll pause it for a while so you see the complete feel of this cardiac cycle over here. So blood from the auricles is thrown here, auriculoventricular valves close, semilunar valves open, and the blood is thrown rapidly. So this is what we have seen so far. Now the blood is slowly being pushed into the aorta and pulmonary arteries. So at the end of this phase, the semilunar valves now will begin to close. If you again look at the pressure and volume during this particular phase, you would now observe that the pressure inside the ventricle is slowly going down as compared to pressure of the blood inside the aorta and pulmonary artery. Similarly, you would also see that the volume of blood in the ventricle has gone down, and it has almost gone down to zero. So you see that blood flow out of the ventricle decreases, and when the pressure in the ventricles fall below the pressure in the arteries, the blood in the arteries begin to flow back towards the ventricle and cause the semilunar valves to close. So two important events which are taking place over here is that the blood flow into the artery and aorta is decreasing, and secondly, the backflow is causing semilunar valves to close. Now, during the phase of reduced ejection, you would see a small deflection here, and this small deflection is because of the ventricular repolarization. Now remember, we have talked about polarization, then we talked about depolarization, where the outer side of the membrane becomes negatively charged and inner side remains positively charged. When the membrane of the muscle cell, they come back to the original state, we call it as repolarization. So the membrane is positive on the outer side again, and on the inner side it becomes negative. This is called as repolarization. So as a result of this, you see the small deflection, which is called as the T wave, which occurs during the reduced ejection phase. And during this phase, there is no heart sound as such. Then we come down to the next event, which is called as isovolumetric relaxation. During isovolumetric relaxation, the AV valves are closed. So as you can see here, now the auricles, they begin to fill up again, but the auriculoventricular wall, they will remain closed. As you can say, this is relaxation, that means a diastolic stage. Now during this diastolic stage, auricle is under diastole, and since it is under diastole, that means it is relaxing. All the blood which is coming from different parts of the body, the venous blood and the oxygenated blood, the auricles are getting rapidly filled, and the auriculoventricular valve, they remain closed. So as a result of this, the V wave that you see here starts to appear. During this phase, there are no deflections in the ECG whatsoever. And there is this second heart sound which appears. And this is because of the closure of the semilunar valve. So S2 is called as DUP. So first heart sound S1 is called as lub, and the second heart sound S2 is called as dup. Remaining two heart sounds S3 and S4 are the abnormal heart sounds. Now we come down to the next event, that is rapid ventricular filling. Once the AV valves now open again, the blood that has accumulated in the auricles will flow rapidly into the ventricles. Now try to correlate this with auricular systole that we have seen in the beginning. There, on the small volume of blood was sent from the auricle into ventricle via contraction of the auricles. Now this is a spontaneous and passive mechanism where as soon as the AV valves open, the blood rapidly goes into the ventricles. Now, as a result of this, the ventricular volume, as you can see here, it begins to increase rapidly. During this phase, there is no deflection whatsoever that can be observed in ECG. However, under abnormal conditions such as congestive heart failure, severe hypertension, myocardial infarction, or mitral incompetence, an abnormal third heart sound S3 can be observed. And now we come down to next event, which is reduced ventricular filling. So now when the blood rapidly rushed into the ventricle, remaining blood, it flows very slowly from the auricle into the ventricles. Here now you would see the volume and the pressure. The volume of the blood in the ventricle has gone up considerably. This is the pressure of the pulmonary arteries and aorta, which is depicted here. The ventricles, they still have very less pressure because it is under the state of diastole. The auricular pressure has gone down. So ventricular volume increases and they continue to fill the blood until they are full. So as far as ECG is concerned, there is no deflection again over here, and there are no hard sounds observed as well. So once these steps are completed, again the next cycle starts from the auricular systole. So we can visualize this complete picture in this form. That means initially the auricles, they begin to contract. Then there is isovolumetric contraction of the ventricles. Ventricular ejection takes place. Then isovolumetric relaxation, that means ventricular diastole takes place. Then the filling of the ventricles take place during the ventricular diastole, and again auricles, they rapidly rush the blood into ventricles, followed by the atrial contraction. So for this lecture of mine, I have gone through various references. I acknowledge the media sources and animations taken from these sources as well. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. If you have any questions, you can email me down to shriharipingle@gmail.com. Please follow this YouTube channel, subscribe and press the bell icon. Thank you very much.